I do not drive. I do have a driver's license and I can afford a vehicle of my own, but years ago I decided that I wanted a lifestyle where I don't drive, and I have since stuck to it. This may not seem like a big deal to viewers in countries where living car-free is common, but living without a car is such a novelty in North America that some people are baffled by it. For me, living without a car is actually really easy. I am lucky enough to live in an area that is within walking distance of my workplace, a few grocery stores, and several eateries. There are plenty of places nearby for running errands. If I must travel somewhere that is outside of a reasonable walking distance, my primary means of transportation is an electric scooter, the Ninebot Kick Scooter Max. This scooter has an insane range that can bring me from South Reno to the downtown area and back again on a single charge, which is far further than I need on a typical day. Getting stuff home simply requires tying a reusable bag to the handlebars and placing items in the bag. As for larger things, there are plenty of home delivery services, such as the ones offered by Target. Inclement weather hasn't affected my mobility either. The scooter handles rain just fine, and I just have to go slower in case the ground is slippery. Snow, on the other hand, is only a problem because a lot of places around town do not do a good job clearing the sidewalks. Otherwise, riding through cold weather is just fine. The only real weather concern is the heat. But I have noticed that it's actually better to ride during the heat than to walk in it. The main difficulties that I face are all related to infrastructure and urban planning. Nonetheless, I would rather deal with these inconveniences than the ones that come with driving. There used to be a time where I actually did drive myself around, hence why I have the license. And in that short period of time, I only grew to loathe the activity entirely. When I was a student attending the University of Nevada, Reno, I was living in Carson City with my parents. I had two options for commuting to the university. Either I had to drive, or I could take the RTC Regional Connector, which is an intercity bus route that ran 5 days a week, with 3 morning trips and 3 afternoon trips. For the most part, this route was a functional way of getting me to and from school. However, due to limitations with the bus schedule, there were times where I had no choice but to drive. The last bus would depart from 4th Street Station at 5:27 p.m. So on semesters where I had classes that got off at 5:15 p.m., it would be physically impossible for me to walk from the classroom to the nearest bus stop in time for me to get home. I suppose I could have waited for the class to be scheduled at a better time, but I really didn't like the idea of delaying my education an unknown number of semesters in the hopes that eventually things will work out and the class will be held at a better time. Furthermore, the final exam schedule did not always match the class time. I could have a class that was scheduled from 1 p.m. to 2:15, while the final would be held from 5 to 7 p.m. at night. And the same issue could happen for morning classes. It all seemed fairly random. So even if I did have a class that was scheduled within the time that I could take the bus, the final exam may not even be held close to the class time, so I'd have to drive anyway. Consequently, there were times where there was no other option. All I could think about was the sheer amount of time I had to spend driving from Carson City to UNR. It was about an hour commute, so I was spending nearly 2 hours, which is longer than the lectures themselves, staring at the road in front of me, watching out for other drivers, and keeping my foot on the gas pedal. It was mentally exhausting. I found myself getting increasingly more annoyed at basic things, especially getting gas. There is something about driving to work to get money that is in turn spent refueling the vehicle to go back to work that is absolutely maddening to me. While I was a student, I did have a summer job at the campus bookstore, but I noticed that a substantial portion of the money that I made was being spent on transportation. It wasn't directly benefiting me or my education, it was just feeding the car so I can get back to school. I didn't think about it much at the time, but there are also plenty of infrastructure issues that made driving less comfortable and more tedious. I could never tell how fast I was supposed to be going. Speed limits appear completely random. You can have two seemingly identical roads, but they have very different speed limits for whatever reason. Similarly, you could have the same stretch of road, but halfway through it, it just randomly changes speed limits for no apparent reason. There's no change in the geometry to better signal to drivers that it's a time to slow down. I also remember having tailgaters flash their lights or honk their horns because I was going too slow for them, when I was really just going the posted speed limit. It's funny how no cyclist ever seems to take issue with me riding my scooter too slowly. In addition to nonsensical speed limits, were the stroads. A strode tries to simultaneously maximize speed, similarly to a road or a highway, while also having a lot of complexity, with bike lanes and entrances to parking lots kind of like a street. This results in a location that is outright hostile to pedestrians and drivers alike. It is stressful driving through these areas while constantly having to look out for vehicles exiting the driveways, making left turns, merging, and having other drivers demand that you go faster. I also had this weird feeling of vertigo at stoplights, especially after driving on stroads with high speeds. The world in front of me appeared to keep crawling forward even though the vehicle itself was stopped. It was like my mind was out of sync with the actual speed of the vehicle, and it was still processing what was actually happening. As you could probably guess, it wasn't a pleasant feeling. Oddly enough, it only happened when I was driving, never as a passenger. Finally, there is something about driving that feels rather dehumanizing. I know it sounds ridiculous, but hear me out. Drivers are placed into metal cages that obscure the actual person, so others are not perceived as people, whereas obstacles. Pedestrians, people on bikes, and even other drivers are seen as obstructions that impede someone from getting to their destination. I do believe this is part of the reason that drivers complain about traffic, not realizing that they are the traffic. Because of all these issues, driving was never something I did out of enjoyment, whereas something I had to put up with out of requirement. My worst experience with driving happened in 2016 or 2017. I cannot quite remember. I had a final exam end around 7 p.m. after dark. I already wasn't comfortable with driving at night, but this night was special because there was also a heavy rainstorm. I didn't want to drive after this final, but between UNR being unwilling to reschedule final exam times and there being no transit between Reno and Carson City after 5:27, I didn't have much of a choice. I begrudgingly began to drive from UNR back to Carson City. I don't remember too many details of this night, other than there being an unusual amount of congestion along the I-580. As it turned out, the congestion was being caused by a bit of a pileup that happened somewhere along the freeway. I remember passing an emergency crew and a bunch of crashed cars that were only illuminated by the yellow glow of the overhead lights. The worst part of the trip was in Washoe Valley. There were no streetlights, so the only thing illuminating the highway was my headlights, which were being drowned out by the rain. Washoe Valley gets incredibly windy, especially during these kinds of storms, so I could feel the car getting blown around. All I could do was focus on staying in the lane, trying not to get blown over to the shoulder, and hoping that I can get home safely. Nothing bad happened to me on this night. I was able to get home. I only remember it because of all the bad things that could have happened to me. Because of these experiences, I was ready to swear off driving forever. I couldn't help but feel neglected by Reno and Carson City's urban planning decisions. All of this could have been avoided if there was just one later bus in the evening to ensure that I could safely get home after 5:15. I tried to find a report to better recollect my worst driving experience to no avail. Looking back, there is something about freeway driving that is utterly psychotic to me. People are frequently getting into crashes, getting injured, or even being killed on our freeways, and we just hand-wave them as accidents. Nobody drives past a collision on the freeway and takes the time to question why this has to be the status quo. They just complain about how they are late to wherever they are going and move on as if this is a necessary evil. The time that I spent driving and relying on the bus system really shaped how I view urban planning. Funny enough, I wasn't majoring in civil engineering, whereas computer science. I eventually learned about walkable cities and transit-oriented developments. I also learned that, historically, our cities used to have the amenities that new urbanists advocate for. One fun fact that genuinely irks me is that there used to be a train that ran from Reno to Carson City and Virginia City called the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. And if it was still around today, people could just take the train instead of drive. It genuinely bothers me that our cities are incredibly car-centric, yet whenever someone receives their driver's license for the first time, they're reminded that driving is a privilege, not a right. If driving is such a privilege, then why don't we build our cities like it is? It should not be a privilege to have independent mobility. Not everyone is able to drive. There are people who are too young or too old. Some people have disabilities that prevent them from operating a motor vehicle. Some people cannot afford a car of their own. And some people, like myself, simply do not want to deal with all of the garbage that comes with it. These demographics are completely neglected in car-centric urban planning, and that's the reason why I have a lot of animosity towards Reno as a city. I may not need a car anymore, but I still wouldn't consider where I live to be a walkable community. It's really just slightly less car-centric than usual. Technically, if an able-bodied person is daring enough, anywhere can be walkable, so it is important to distinguish places that can be walked through and places that are designed around the scale and comfort of people. Car-centric urban planning is just as much of an issue in South Reno as it was when I was living in Carson City. The only difference is that now I have a scooter that gets me to where I need to go, so I don't have to rely on a car to get to my destination. I have only been able to comfortably live car-free for about 3 years. Even then, I still deal with plenty of the issues that arise from car-centric urban planning. Every single time I go to work, run errands, capture video footage, or just ride my scooter around town, I am reminded of all the frustrations that come from the way Reno is designed. It is disheartening knowing that those of us who do not want to drive or cannot drive are ultimately neglected by bad urban planning. If there is one thing that I can be happy about, there are a lot more people speaking up about these problems than there were when I was a university student. Just a few years ago, people had to go out of their way to learn about how much the car has transformed and destroyed our cities. Outside of the Adam Ruins Everything episodes on cars and suburbia, there weren't many people presenting this information to general audiences. This has changed a lot recently. There are now many different TikTok accounts, subreddits, and of course YouTube channels, among plenty of other places on social media where people discuss the same subject. I don't want to overestimate the importance of Not Just Bikes, but at the same time, I'm not really convinced that you can. His channel really helped give a lot of people the words needed to describe precisely what's wrong with their cities. There is still a long way to go, but I feel like a lot of the ignorance is slowly being chiseled away. When I first discovered his videos, I had a cathartic realization that there are plenty of other people who also take issue with how North American cities are built. I was right to complain that driving is the primary way of getting from Carson City to Reno. Discovering Not Just Bikes led me down a rabbit hole where I found plenty of other urban planning channels. I want Reno and other cities to get better. I believe the first step to accomplishing this is to have as many people discussing what is wrong with their cities as possible and expanding the message to even more communities. As more people understand what is wrong with our cities and how to improve it, we can collectively begin pressuring city councils and political leaders into making the correct decisions that reduce car dependency and improve quality of life for everyone. If anyone else wants to get started and share their perspective, it is incredibly easy. Smartphones can capture video and audio to create raw footage. DaVinci Resolve is free editing software that can further refine the videos, and there are plenty of avenues to share them, such as the many different Reddit communities that are also built around sharing this kind of content. The more people who can spread the good word to outside communities and enlighten others as to why they may be dissatisfied with the cities they live in, the better. At least now, if someone genuinely despises driving as much as I do, they can at least take solace in knowing that they aren't alone in feeling like there is a problem with designing cities like this.